Hello everyone. Before we start today's video, if you could all do me a solid and lightly tap the like button, perhaps share the video about and leave a comment. If you are not subscribed, subscribe as well. It would greatly help this channel. Thank you very much. Well, isn't this just fantastic? Captain's log, subjects 220919.3. Anyone here done an Earth War before? They're jolly good fun and remarkably cathartic. I highly recommend it after a number of bottles of whiskey, or honeycomb-infused booze. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to look at something I saw as an image on Twitter that I genuinely believed was, much like the emojis on the tweet itself, a bit of clowning around. Turns out that is not the case. This might also seem a little different from last week where we predominantly covered various types of YouTube-related drama. Sorry about this, folks. I find this interesting too, though. So the image from the tweet, from the account of Clown World Today, separating sports by sex does not make sense. Though school sports are typically sex segregated, a new generation of kids isn't content to compete within traditional structures. By Maggie Mertens. Let's just quickly analyze this, shall we? Separating sports by sex does not make sense. Clearly you've not watched the Australian women's football team against 15-year-old boys. Adults against boys? Well, they were annihilated. The women, that is. It was a great demonstration of how teams work well together. It also showed physical advantages even though they were younger. These same physical advantages will always exist. It is not about making someone feel inferior. If you're looking at a sport, by the way, and you think you're inferior because you're not in that sport with those people, that sounds like a you problem. The only people that are inferior in a sport are the ones that lose, not those that can't compete, because if they did compete, they would also, for the most part, lose. There is a vastly more complicated way of explaining all of this. When you get down to the science of it, with bone density, muscle mass, along with talking about the endocrine system, because that plays a part that makes some people sharper than others, more reactive than others, their reflexes react a certain way because of this, and you start to understand these genetic differences are very obvious. When I said endocrine system, at no point was I thinking, oh, but she's on her period, that means she's not. No, it's a minor setback, I'll agree. But inferiority is not determined by whether or not you have a period. But that is where the mistake is made. It's the very fact that you think because they are separated by sex, or some people think they are separated by sex, one has to be inferior to the other. No, it's like in school, when you are separated into sets, depending on your intellectual academic background. If you are smarter, you're put in a top set. If you are clearly not as good as them, you are placed in a lower set. That's academia, by the way. And while I can fully agree this is a bit of a false equivalence, it is an important distinction to make. But as I don't want to be dragged into semantics of that, I think we should now go to an article, because it turns out it actually exists, courtesy of The Atlantic, published on the 17th of September 2022. As today is the 19th of September 2022, we can all rejoice that Omegon, for a change, has actually jumped onto a subject that was only released a couple days ago. Not that it makes a blind bit of difference. Shira Mendelzis fell in love with flag football while playing on a middle school team. An avid snowboarder and all-round athletic kid, she loved the energy she felt while on the field, and the camaraderie engendered by the intensely physical game. So last summer, heading into her junior year at Riverdale Country School in the Bronx, Shira decided to sign up for football. She would be the only girl, but it was a no-cut, no-tryout team, so she figured the worst she'd have to deal with would be not feeling welcomed by the team. Instead, soon after she filled out the enrollment form, Riverdale's athletic director reached out to Shira about specific requirements she would have to meet in order to join the team. Because Shira was a girl trying to join a boys' sport, she had to abide by a set of mixed-gender sports regulations that the New York State Education Department passed back in 1985. These rules, which were developed in part to protect girls from harm during competitions, required that Shira submit a record of her past performance in physical education classes a doctor's physical documenting her medical history and assessments of her body type, height, weight, joint structure, and sexual maturity level, which is known as the Tanner scale. Once she passed a fitness test including a 1-mile run, sprints, push-ups, and curl-ups, she sent her scores to a closed-door panel including physical education staff, other administrators of the school's choosing, and a consulting physician. The panel then set out to determine whether Shira was essentially strong, developed, and athletic enough to play a contact sport with boys, even though the boys needed to prove no such thing. Has anyone else noticed the framing of this yet? The intense scrutiny that is being placed on Shira to prove she is capable of playing with the boys, in a sport where there may well be competitions and your school may well want to win. Say it's a state level, county level, inter-school, inter-department level. You know what I mean? The framing of this is, the scrutiny is unjust. That is what the point is already. But is it right? In the context of flag football, I'm not entirely sure. I actually had to look up what flag football was. For those who don't know, it is a variant of American football, so not actual football where you kick a ball on the ground. Instead, the defensive team have to remove a flag or flag belt from the ball carrier to end a down. So the aspect of physical contact is a little different. And you're not wearing body armor, because it's nowhere near as intensely physical. I had originally recorded a minute-long rant about this before I realized it said flag football. We're redoing it, everyone. It's an electric boogaloo. While watching some clips of what flag football is, I noticed it is still intensely physical in its own way. Your reflexes have to be quite sublime. You have to be exceptionally fast. But at the same time, once I started to focus on this, I realized there was a risk of taking away from the original point. So perhaps we should go back to the article to continue to understand the problem Shira is having or has had. Although Shira's exact experience may seem rare, it exemplifies the way many people still view sports as a perfectly reasonable venue in which to enforce exclusion on the basis of sex. School sports are typically sex segregated, so are adult ones. And in America, the center of the world, some of them have even come to be seen as either traditionally for boys or traditionally for girls. That's because of personal choice and the prevalence in those personal choices, but also because many people were not interested in sports. There has been an increase, which the article itself later references, in girls' involvement in certain sports. Now imagine the interest in participating in, for example, as mentioned in this article, wrestling. If those same women were having to wrestle men, it will end one way and it will look really bad on the male and the school. You know this. A level of intellectual stuntedness is blinding you to this. Think football, wrestling, field hockey, volleyball. However, it's becoming more common for those lines to blur, especially as Gen Zers are more likely than members of previous generations to reject a strict gender binary altogether. Maintaining this binary in youth sports reinforces the idea that boys are inherently bigger, faster, and stronger than girls in a competitive setting, a notion that has been challenged by scientists for years. Do I need to now re-show the under-15s against the Australian women's football team? They had better chemistry, they were faster, when it came to tackling, they were on it. The reflexes were sharp. Decades of research have shown that sex is far more complex than we may think, and though sex differences in sport show advantages for men, researchers today still don't know how much of this to attribute to biological difference versus the lack of support provided to women athletes to reach their highest potential. Well, let's take a sport where, let's say, physical attributes aren't really as much of a thing, and yet the results are still there. Darts and snooker. We have men's and women's categories, and we have had women from the respective category then go and compete on the men's circuit, or try and get in on the men's circuit. None of them have cracked it and stayed there. Some have been given abilities to, and some have actually managed to beat men in some settings, but not make enough progress to actually make a real impact. On Yi for snooker is an obvious one, and she's incredibly talented, but she's not managed to stay on the circuit with the blokes because the difference is obvious. And that's a very different kind of sport altogether. Hand-eye coordination, understanding of angles, eyesight are key. Science is increasingly showing how sex is dynamic. It has multiple aspects and also shifts. For example, social experiences can actually change levels of sex-related hormones like testosterone in our bodies in a second-to-second and month-to-month way. This comes from Sari van Anders, the research chair in social neuroendocrinology at Queen's University in Ontario. She said that this complexity means it doesn't make sense to separate sports by sex in order to protect women athletes from getting hurt. It depends on the sport, although it also depends on which version of hurt you're referring to as well. Being quoted as saying, "If safety was a concern, and there was evidence to select certain bodily characteristics to base safety cutoffs on, then you would see, say, shorter men excluded from competing with taller men, or lighter women from competing with heavier women across sports. We do see weight class separation in boxing, rowing, and wrestling, yet it's far from the norm across all sports, and isn't typically seen as a method of integrating athletes of different sexes. I would also argue you also separate by weight American football players. Linebackers, they're not usually the smallest, are they? And by the way, like in basketball, you have many different weights, you have many different heights. Each has a different style of play. Think this through, please. Additionally, in many different sports, the team that hires a person in competitive sports, especially when you get paid a salary and stuff, they will instill a strict sort of weight for you, because if you don't perform at your best, which is usually at your optimum weight, they're not going to want to pay you or keep you around. Take, for example, Formula 1, a very high-speed driving sport. The drivers aren't going to be fat now, are they? There are always going to be a form of weight limit, whether the team imposes it or not. They want to get the very best out of you depending on the sport you're in. You mentioned boxing as a weight class thing. There's a reason for that. Even with a 4-pound weight gap in some of the lower weight classes, you can hit a lot harder. A lot harder. The article then introduces a swerve in the form of Colin Ives, who graduated from Hackley School in Tarrytown, New York earlier this year. Colin is someone that played field hockey, which in America is seen more as a girls' sport. So he had to go through the same New York State mixed gender competition rules to get on the team. He was subsequently approved by the school's panel during his freshman and sophomore years. But Colin then went through the process, and then just days before a league game, the head of the school informed him that Ives was not allowed to play. Hackley itself had approved the petition, but the other private high school that made up the Ivy Preparatory School League said no, and in this instance they should well be within their right to do so, because they had, the other school that is, determined that Colin had an advantage in a girls' team event. They had believed that he would be simply too good. And there's a point to that as well. But again, the framing of the article is quite misleading. It is to try and infer, imply, suggest, outright state that these very notions are bigoted. You are wrong. In recent years, the question of who can play on what team has developed into a full-blown front in the culture warg, based in large part on the fear that transgender girls will unfairly take over girls' sports because of sweeping generalizations about biological athletic advantages. As of this writing, 18 states have passed laws to ban trans girls and women from playing on certain school teams. But perhaps what's missing most from that debate is the question over why there are rigidly segregated girls' teams and boys' teams at all. Because of the same reason many are banning transgender athletes from competing in the event for the gender they identify with, because they still retain advantages. We could insert the trailblazer Laurel Hubbard, a number of cyclists over the years. You could include a mixed martial artist if you want, one that caved in other people's skulls. Not going to say their name, I'll be accused of being bigoted perhaps. I'm above that shit. The insistence on separating sports teams strictly by sex is backwards, argues Michaela Musto, an assistant sociology professor at the University of British Columbia. Why is this all coming from Canada? Who has studied the effect of the gender binary on students and young athletes, being quoted as saying, part of the reason why we have this belief that boys are inherently stronger than girls, and even the fact that we believe that gender is binary is because of sport itself, not the other way round. Continuing, there are some boys who also could get really hurt if they were competing against other boys in contact sports. As justification, yes, you're right. But boys are built genetically to be able to withstand it a bit better than a female. You might not like me saying that, but that is the truth, and that truth has been demonstrably proven true multiple times. It really has. researchers have also hypothesized that the gap they did find between girls and boys was likely due to socialization and not biology. I'm getting an aneurysm from this. I really am. While the need to separate athletes by sex is still held firmly by many as a way to protect girls and women from harm, many advocate for moving to a more integrated and inclusive approach. I'll be honest, if you did that, I think you would in turn harm women's involvement in sport, where they have made tremendous strides to improve the quality of what they do in their sports, to make it more popular and palatable, which in turn will get more women involved in something for them. Making a sport where everyone can play together will lead to an inevitable outcome. Either the sport won't be a sport but be an event where everyone just participates, which in turn may as well just be everyone holding hands around a campfire singing Kumbaya bollocks, or you'd end up with just boys. The article continues, by the way, for quite some time. I can promise you this, going back to talk about Shira and lawyers, because it's American, everyone has to get sued for something, does not help anything, and then later also talks about statistics of women's involvement in sports. Yes, but these women's involvement in sports are in women's categories. If you now make it inclusive, I promise those numbers will go down because of what I earlier mentioned. The words "get good scrub" I guess might come up and be used a fair bit. Best of luck.